Hello, I'm Hassan Ajami. I'm a Lebanese author and a freelance journalist. I also teach Arabic language and Arab Islamic culture. Today our topic is Islam. The theory that I would like to defend is the following. Islam is indeterminate. The content of Islam is indeterminate. It is indeterminate what Islam is saying. In other words, Islam doesn't speak. It only speaks if you interpret it. This is why we don't have a single Islam, but we have Islams with an S. Islam is indeterminate. The content of Islam is indeterminate because there are different messages and doctrines within Islam itself. This theory, which claims that Islam is indeterminate, has an explanatory power. It explains certain interesting phenomena, and therefore the theory is highly plausible. For example, the theory explains why we have radically different interpretations of Islam. Since Islam is indeterminate, it follows that there are different and radically different interpretations of Islam. Therefore, the theory in itself explains why we have radically different interpretations of Islam. If Islam is determinate, if the content of Islam is determinate, there should be only one interpretation of Islam. But since we have different and radically different interpretations of Islam, it follows that Islam in itself is indeterminate. The theory claims that it is an objective property of Islam that its contents are indeterminate. For example, we have the liberal interpretation of Islam. One verse in the Quran says there is no compulsion in religion, which means I shouldn't impose my religion on you. And this is a liberal interpretation of Islam. Another verse, for example, in the Quran says, I have my religion and you have your religion. In this way, if there is a conflict between me and you, I would say I have my religion and you have your religion, and therefore the conflict in itself is automatically and immediately resolved, because you are entitled to have your own beliefs. This is the liberal interpretation of Islam. Another interpretation of Islam, which is different from the first, is the socialist interpretation of Islam. As you know, there is a principle of redistribution of wealth in Islam, which is manifested in almsgiving. According to Islam, Muslims should provide 2.5% of their savings and business revenues to the poor and the needy. And also, they should provide 5 to 10% of one's harvest also to the poor and the needy every year. And this is a socialist interpretation of Islam. A third possible interpretation of Islam is the fundamentalist interpretation of Islam, according to which there is no separation between religion, namely Islam, on one hand, and the state and society on the other hand. In other words, Islam as a religion should control the state and the society in itself. And this is the fundamentalist interpretation of Islam. As we have seen, there are at least now three radically different interpretations of Islam, which is the liberal, socialist, and the fundamentalist interpretation of Islam. And the question is, why do we have such radically different interpretations of Islam? The answer is that it is so because Islam in itself is indeterminate. Since Islam is indeterminate, this is why we have radically different interpretations of Islam. So the content of Islam in itself depends on us, on our human interpretation of it. As I mentioned, Islam in itself, the Quran and the sayings of Muhammad, they don't speak to us. They only speak to us if we interpret them. Another example here is that in the Quran itself, there's a verse which claims that we will see God in the afterlife. Other verses in the Quran claim that God can see us, but we can't see God. This shows that the content of Islam is indeterminate. Also within Islam itself, there is a principle of an eye for an eye. Another radically different principle, which is also indicated in the Quran, is that we have to forgive others. But these two principles, the principle of an eye for an eye, and the other principle, which is the principle of forgiving people, both of these two principles, in fact, they are different from each other. They are radically different from each other. This shows that the content of Islam is indeterminate. The best way to look at what's going on in Islam is to claim that there is a principle or a mechanism of freedom within Islam itself. Here, Islam is trying to maximize our freedom. For example, I can be a Muslim if I act in light of the principle an eye for an eye. And also, I can be a Muslim if I forgive others. And similarly, I can be a Muslim if I believe that I will see God in the afterlife. Also, I will be a Muslim if I believe that we can never see God at all. So here, Islam is maximizing our freedom, or the freedom of its followers, by combining and uniting different theories and views within the same religion, which we call Islam. Now, the question is, why is Islam indeterminate? It is indeterminate in order for it to be useful in different times and circumstances. For example, in certain circumstances, maybe the principle of an eye for an eye is beneficial for me and for my society. But in different times, maybe, or in different circumstances, maybe the principle of forgiving others is beneficial for me and for my society. In this manner, Islam itself is indeterminate in order for it to be useful in different times and circumstances. And also, as I mentioned previously, Islam also is indeterminate in order to maximize the freedom of people, because Islam in itself depends on us, on the human intellect. Without the human intellect, the content of Islam in itself is indeterminate. So the content of Islam is indeterminate. It only becomes determinate if I interpret it or you interpret it. In this way, Islam is giving a huge margin of freedom to people, because Islam in itself depends on our own interpretation. Now, this theory which claims that Islam is indeterminate is the only and the best explanation of the fact that Islam, which is the Quran and the sayings of Muhammad, etc., contains different and diverse views. Otherwise, we would claim that Islam is inconsistent by unifying different doctrines, and therefore Islam is irrational. But of course, the claim that Islam is irrational is not objective and not scientific, because our aim is to communicate with the Muslims. So if we claim that Islam is irrational, therefore we are terminating the communication with the Muslims. And of course, we don't want to do that. At the same time, if we claim that Islam is irrational, then we will be terminating or ending the inquiry which aims at understanding Islam and the Muslims. But our aim is not to terminate or to end the inquiry which aims at understanding Islam. Therefore, the only option now that we have is to claim that Islam in itself is indeterminate. Finally, the fact that Islam is indeterminate is both a virtue and a vice at the same time. It is a virtue because it maximizes our freedom by making Islam dependent on our interpretations of it. But at the same time, the fact that Islam is indeterminate is also a vice, because it leads to constant conflicts among the Muslims themselves. Because now the Muslims will always disagree on what is the right interpretation of Islam in light of the fact that Islam is indeterminate. So the fact that Islam is indeterminate is both a virtue and a vice at the same time. Thank you for listening.